Oh, yeah! It's time for another episode of the Comic Book Kaiju. I am your host, Vactor, and I have a very special friend on the line, my original co-host of the Geekland podcast, all the way from Blank, Tennessee, Mr. Chris Eaton.
How's it going?
Excellent.
Doing quite well.
I am
Knoxville, Tennessee.
I am very pleased to have Mr. Eaton on the line because, like I said, Chris Eaton was my very first co-host that I ever had on Geekland. And that was my very first solo podcast because I had done an Xbox podcast before that, but that was my first solo one. So I want to get all into that history as well as where Mr. Eaton has been since then. But before we do that, let's just tell our listeners that they can always leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, whichever one your heart desires, wherever you're listening to it now. As well as if you're on YouTube, leave us a review down below. Let us know what you'd like to hear about on the Comic Book Kaiju. We always appreciate that. And don't forget to subscribe if you're not subscribed so far. But let's get right into it.
Subscribe, click the bell, do all the things.
That's the thing that we love to say. Mr. Eaton, I'm very curious. Let's start off with your comic book origin story first. How did you get into comics and what kind of drew you to that?
It's an interesting question. I'm into two big things in my life. Have always been comics and pro wrestling. And I couldn't really tell you when I got into either one because I don't remember a time when I wasn't. So it's sort of always been kind of running in the background of my life, really, comics anyway. And that's one of the ways I started reading pretty early on. And one of the reasons for that was comics. I'd get comics and be able to, learn how to read and everything like that. So they've always kind of been around me, really.
Nice. Very nice. And so we met up kind of, I would say, around college age, right?
It was 07.
Yes,
I believe.
Yes, that's right.
07. I had just moved. I had started college in 04, and then I moved to Memphis in 07, and was just looking for, people that are into the same. You look for people who are the same kind of weird as you are, and ended up finding Mr. Vactor.
Yeah. And at the time, I was going by my middle name, Justin Vactor, and now I've gone back to my first name, and the reason why specifically was because my wife, when I met her, I just asked her, "Hey, which name do you like better?" And she said, "Trent, your first name."
Well, then that's the name. Then I mean,
I also like I like to kind of combine. Okay, the people who knew me as Justin and the people who knew me as Trent just call me Vactor. So that doesn't. There's no confusion.
Split the difference.
So
gotcha.
that is my naming convention. But when we met, like I said, I was Justin, and was it Facebook or MySpace?
MySpace.
Okay, dang.
It was MySpace.
Holy crap!
Because we're old.
We found we found that we were both in the same city, both like comics, and
had just moved there.
Right. So you were the one who reached out to me, if I recall correctly, and then
I believe that's correct. Yeah.
Were you looking to start a podcast? I can't remember at that time.
Podcasting, it was around, but it was a fairly new innovation, which I mean, really just goes back to old radio shows, but nonetheless, and was looking for a way to talk about this stuff that I loved. Yeah. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so, podcasting definitely. I believe I was listening at the time to Comic GeekSoToSpeak, which I think we both listened to, and Fanboy Radio, which I don't think that exists anymore. But I was listening to both of those. And so I wanted to do something like that to get around a table or something like that with your friends and discuss comics. Yes. It sounded like the best thing in the world. So that's what I set out to do.
Nice. That is the exact same for me. And we hooked up in Memphis, got together, formed Geekland because of the connection to Graceland. That was the naming convention. We did Geekland. I think we were fairly successful as far as we did what we wanted to do, talked in the comic shop every week, and then we both went separate ways. I moved back to Arizona, and you moved to, where did you go from Memphis?
I went back home. I went back to a little town called
Right.
McKenzie. If any of you listening out there know where it is, I'm very surprised. There's nothing there, except for Bethel University, which is where I started college. So I went back there and proceeded to get a job, uh, substitute teaching during the day, working at Walmart in the evenings for many years until I got my full time job that I have now. But that's sort of the snapping away, like you talk about. I tried to keep up with sort of nerd culture, but what was going on maybe in the comics. But I as far as reading week to week, that ended pretty much when I graduated because I wasn't near a comic
Mm,
shop, and we didn't have the app readers that we have
right.
nowadays, and even the systems by which we'd find them on the off falling off the back of a truck weren't as sophisticated as they are
Right.
now. So it just became something that I tried to stay at least peripherally aware of, but I wasn't participating in as much.
Yeah. And so you got snapped away, much like myself. And then very recently, within the last year or so, I would say I've been trying to come back from the snapping and get back to where I was reading weekly, knowing what's going on.
Right.
For you, what was that like? When did you kind of get that itch or that urge again to get back into comics?
Well, I'd had it ever since that we had like digital comics become a mainstream kind of thing and a very easily accessible thing. And so that was one of the processes. But the other thing was that I had moved again, and once I got settled here, then I said, well, I'm settled now, and I'd like to get back into some of this stuff. Check back in, see where it is, get uh, aware of it
Mm,
again, and everything like that. Just life sort of speeds up, and you lose track of stuff. You know what I mean?
yeah,
So I'd like to sort of get back a hold of
yeah.
that.
And up to this point, we are currently recording this in July of 2022. What comics
Mhm.
have you been reading recently that you've been kind of starting your journey back in?
Right. Hickman's X
Yes,
Men.
yes.
Um, I really I just finished what is it?
House of X,
House of
Powers
X and
of
Powers of
10.
10.
Yes.
Right. Just finished that. It's a real kind of a mind bender. Not unlike how I felt when I read Morrison's New
Mm,
X Men, which is like one of my favorite runs of
right.
comics ever. So that I've really been following closely. I haven't yet uh, dived back into DC so as much. It's mainly been Marvel, but I am sort of keeping aware of what they're doing over in DC. I just haven't dove back into that side of the pool
Yeah, and
yet.
that's actually,
But the Hickman X Men is one of the things that's like, oh, I want to keep track of all
yes,
this.
that's actually very similar to me. I've been diving in, especially because I have a Marvel Unlimited subscription, and it has been
Mm-hmm.
like a game changer. Kind of like when Netflix first kind of went digital and streaming. It was like
Right.
just having access to everything and not having to worry about
Mm-hmm.
anything. And then kind of the way it's organized, the user interface is real nice, real slick. So I've been jumping headfirst into Marvel, and I did the same thing with Hickman's X Men. And then very recently, like
Mm-hmm.
within the last week or two, I've been delving a little bit, dipping my toe into DC with Tom Taylor's Nightwing, which I want to put out some more content about, because I would say, dang, it's a toss up between House of X, Powers of 10, and Tom Taylor's Nightwing. Those are my favorite things I've read this year. So
I'll have to check that
yes,
Nightwing book out then.
100%. It has that very Peter Parker Spider-Man feel to it, with Dick Grayson.
Okay.
So
Okay.
yeah, very very highly recommend that. Um, but I think, like I said, we're kind of, we've been on diverging paths through our times in comics, and
Mm-hmm.
we're coming back to another convergence point here. So definitely, I want to keep on checking in with you on your comics progress, and also when you
Sure.
have specific stuff that you love, like with Hickman's X-Men, or something that's blowing your mind. I definitely want to check in with you and get all of that out there to the world and get some more Eatonness in the world. Uh,
We could always use
yeah.
more.
Um, so yeah, I think that's where we're at right now in the current timeline in our multiverse. Now, let me ask you this: as far as like other comic book properties, other mediums, animated or live action, have you been keeping up with any of the Disney Plus stuff?
Have been. I watched Moon Knight most recently. I haven't watched Miss Marvel yet. I do want to get on that. Uh, that's one thing that's been great about kind of how we have changed media. Not we haven't.
Right.
Media has changed how it sort of presents itself, especially in the midst of the
Yeah.
pandemic when that was going on as hot and heavy as it was. I think that really changed
Mm-hmm.
entertainment as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it might end up having changed it for, if not the better, at least the more
Mm-hmm.
accessible.
Right.
So you can go on to Disney Plus or Amazon Prime, whatever it might be, and check out your most recent show that you may have missed an episode or two. You can just binge the whole thing. It's really good. Um, I will say I watched Invincible,
Yes. Yes.
which I thought was
Yeah.
really good. I knew you was going to dig that as soon as I saw it. And then another one, which I don't know if you've seen, but it kind of plays to or to another one of my loves, which is Dungeons and Dragons. The Chronicles, or the was it Vox
Yes. Right.
Machina?
I started
The
that.
Critical Role Legend of Vox Machina is
Yes, I
fantastic,
started it, but I haven't finished
and
it.
there's a comic book based on that as
Ah,
well.
yeah.
There's a few volumes of called Vox Machina Origins, which
Nice.
is fantastic. Comes out of Dark
Okay.
Horse. It's
I
really good
love
too.
those voice
But yeah, I
actors.
love the multimedia stuff going on.
Oh, I
I'm
was going to
sorry,
say
go
I
ahead.
love those voice actors on Critical Role. Yeah.
Oh, they're great. And I watch that
Ah, yeah.
show as well when it
Nice.
comes on. So, but it's interesting the just sheer amount of content that's out there
Right.
nowadays. If and you can kind of be tangentially aware of a lot of stuff without be, on being on
Right.
purpose. Does
Right.
that make sense? Like you're aware of this and that, but I wanted to purposefully get back into comics and really try to dig into that side of it again
Yeah.
because I think it's an art form that is fairly important, um, even though it's just modern myths. I think that it's something that even though we have this digital platform now, I think it doesn't need to go by the
Hmm.
wayside. I think it needs to be around because that kind of stuff is going to stand the test of time, no matter how much life changes, how much our society changes. Because we've had comic books for how long, and I mean we're still here
Right.
talking about it. If you look at the hieroglyphics back in ancient Egypt and stuff, it's pictures telling a sequential story. That's what
Yes.
comics are. So I think it's something that is worthy of our attention, even in this digital world. I think there's something to be said for the old format of a
Yeah.
comic.
And that's something that I want to preserve, pass down to my child. And I think it's going to be interesting when he's at an age where he's going to start reading. I was thinking about this the other day
Mm-hmm.
when I was just driving down the street and thinking about the way that he's going to perceive Iron Man, for example, is different than I perceived Iron Man when I was growing up, and he's going to think it was
Sure.
always like that. Just like when I was reading Spider Man in the
Right.
'90s, I was like, "Oh, he was always like this. He was always with Mary Jane, and nothing ever changed." Um, so I
Right.
just think I just find that idea fascinating. That as we progress and age, the characters are also changing.
Mm-hmm. I think it's really cool that eventually there's going to be somebody who is going to find out Peter Parker was Spider Man and going to be surprised by it because all they maybe all they know
Right.
is
Right.
Miles, which is
Hmm.
which is awesome to me. There are some people that would sort of decry that. I don't see that. I think it's progress and that's what
Yeah.
happens, and that's fine as long as the stories are good. I don't care about that kind of thing. I was having this conversation with another friend of mine
Hmm.
about wrestling, and there's a wrestler in AEW right now, Eddie Kingston, one of my favorite wrestlers, and I was watching a match with him the other night, and it was a really good match back and forth, and the crowd was into it, and they were chanting Eddie, and I thought that was interesting. Of course, when I say Eddie, you probably immediately think of like
Yes.
Eddie Guerrero, but whenever a kid watching this show that just came on a few weeks ago here's Eddie, they're going to think about maybe Eddie Kingston, something like that, and it reminded me of how stuff changes over time, and comics do too. There's always some backlash, but stuff has to
Yeah.
change, y'all. It just
Right.
does.
And I just hope it's not, when we change, we're not losing something, because I think about some of the transitions between formats in movies, and let's say from VHS to DVD to Blu-ray. Not every movie is transferring over and getting, and some things are getting lost in that transition. And
Mm-hmm.
hopefully, the archive process with comics is to the point where it's like, okay, we can always have these um, around for my son to read, and his son to read, or his child. I would like to see that continue, and I'd like to see that medium progress.
Sure.
And it's also, I find it interesting, the balance of legacy characters versus new creations like Miles Morales, and seeing that,
Mm-hmm.
you know, how is he going to look at, like you said, Peter Parker Spider Man versus, oh no, when I think Spider Man, I think Miles Morales. I wonder what that's going
Right.
to be, and what other mediums are going to shape him in the future. Because, like I said, with Iron Man,
Right.
that totally was the MCU. The live action Iron Man reinvigorated the comics, made him a force in the
Mm-hmm.
comics. And then now it's like people think of him as the center of the MCU, but it wasn't like that in the comics, up to that point. So I find all of that stuff fascinating.
Right. Yeah, me too. I mean, it's like I was saying just a moment ago. Uh, your son, when he's our age, maybe his quote unquote Iron Man, maybe it's Ironheart, maybe it's
Right.
Riri Williams, or maybe it's somebody else that we don't even hasn't even been invented
Exactly.
yet. We don't know. Uh, there are people who think that's a bad thing. I'm not. I
Oh
think it's
yeah,
kind of cool.
100%. I just find that to be, just, and you, I think, are exactly like me in that you love just storytelling, whether it's on a podcast, somebody's just,
Yeah.
through orally, or if you're reading it on a page, if you're watching a movie, if you're playing a video game, you're interacting with the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
But just narrative
Absolutely.
and storytelling in general is the bottom line. That's what we're here for,
Yeah.
in all formats. So, and even in your Dungeons and Dragons, or if you're creating the story or you're part of the story, that's just something that it all comes down to storytelling. Like that's what it is when you take it
It
at the
does.
end of the day.
Even
Yes,
wrestling.
right.
Yeah. It's all storytelling, and the humans need stories. That's why we have myths and legends. It's why we have religions. It's why we uh, tell stories of our ancestors that have gone on, and our relatives who have passed away, and we tell it to people who in our family who never knew those people, but we tell those stories because we have to tell stories. That's just it's
Yeah.
important.
So I think the legacy of Chris Eaton is important, and the legacy of storytelling is important. I'm very happy that you have joined me on this ride, and like I said, I'm glad that we converged again, because it was a couple years where we were out and about, and I was actually wondering about you a couple times. I was like, man, I wonder what Eaton's up to, and I didn't have a way of just necessarily reaching out to you directly. So I'm glad that
Right.
we have kind of hooked up again.
Yeah, me too. Life takes some weird left and right turns sometimes, and you kind of have to go off and do your own thing for a while, and come back together, and it's really cool because that in itself
Oh yeah,
there's a story there. You know what I mean? There always is. So it goes back to what we're talking about. But yeah, I'm definitely. I'm glad to bring some big largeness to the comic
yeah,
book kaiju. You know, I love that show. I love hearing you and Seabury and Hunter talk about comics, and I'm going to be
yeah.
stoked to
And
be
we're
part of that.
we're trying to figure out the vehicle for you, because Seabury and Hunter both we're all good friends. We're all have a history together. We're all connected to Memphis. And actually, that's something with the comic book kaiju.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at our logo, which Hunter created, he wanted it to have the Memphis skyline. The kaiju are going over the Memphis skyline
Mm-hmm.
because we're all kind of connected to that city. So I'm
Right.
glad that you're coming along for this ride. But like I said, we're trying to figure out the best uh, vehicle for you so that we can all kind of get a good discussion going. Yeah.
Absolutely. Whether it be books of the month or the weekly review stuff, I'm here for it. Whatever, whatever we want to do. I think I'm just excited to be able to talk to somebody about comics again. Get back into it and try to sort of, I don't know, maybe the audience here will enjoy listening to us. Go on
and
about
hopefully,
them.
yeah.
Let's
Like
hope
I said,
so. Anyway,
if you're watching this on YouTube, leave us a comment down below. And let us know, what do you want to hear Chris Eaton talk about. We will definitely look at all of the comments and and take that as constructive. So we very much appreciate you taking the time out of your day to listen. If you would be so kind, don't forget to let everyone know in your family who is a comic book fan. This is just like we're at the comic shop talking. So share us with your friends and family that like comic books. If you can, leave us a 5-star review in Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That definitely helps us get spread. It's almost like that puts us in the algorithm, pushes us up, lets more people know about the comic book kaiju. But you can always find us wherever your podcasts are found. You can find us here on YouTube, or if you're into other comics or other podcasts, I should say, we have a podcast network over at GeekSoToSpeak.com/network. We've got a Star Trek podcast called TREKnological. We've got a video game podcast called the Sandbox Gamers. You are currently listening to the Comic Book Kaiju. And Geek, so to speak, even though it's currently, let's just say it's in retirement right now, there are 200 episodes in the back catalog that you can go through. Mr. Chris Eaton.
And all of them are fantastic.
We would like to let everyone know where you can be found on the internet. Where is that?
You can find me on Twitter at Chris Eaton.
Excellent. And
I got in early enough to not Chris Eaton 4329841.
I
just
also
Chris
got
Eaton.
in pretty early on Vactor, and I guess there's like a trucking company that they're always tagging me. They're like, the new Vactor truck is out, and I go, hey, I tell them I'm not that. That's a different Vactor, wrong Vactor, but they still
Different
do it
Vactor.
on Instagram and Twitter.
Yeah.
But I was early enough that I was able to snag that handle. But excellent. Thank you very much, my friend. I would like everyone to know that Chris Eaton loves comics, and you should too.
Geeks out.